going to be called The Road of Feminism, and there will be no woman in. I wanted to begin this September 2023 Deaf History Month with a reading from Alexander Graham Bell called Memoir upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race. And so now I want to discuss how a fantasy world of silence without deaf people ties into eradication and genocide against deaf people. The video I stitched at the beginning is from the first video I did on all of this called Discrimination in Mainstream Society is Cursed in a World of Silence Relevant to Deafness. I recommend you go look at that video for more information on the sources discussed on the advertisements this content is examining, how deafness is treated as a curse, the disillusionment of deaf people, and examples of how deaf experience disparity in immigration and violence, to consider how these sources are a reflection of Alexander Graham Bell's memoir. Now, someone has chosen to argue with me that because I didn't read the book, my opinions on the way the book was advertised are irrelevant. But as I stated in the video I made about this, the only thing I have broken down is what was explicitly advertised about the book and how those advertisements were ableist. It doesn't matter what the book is about as well if what was said about the book by the author pertains to discrimination. Now, my main problem is they are trying to justify a fantasy world in which there is a world of silence without deaf people. Their specific wording to me was non-deaf people in a world of silence. Now I'm going to read from Alexander Graham Bell, his memoir upon a deaf it's such a ridiculous title. I can't really say it. Memoir upon the Formation of a Deaf Variety of the Human Race. Now, this memoir is 86 pages. 6 chapters are 48 of the pages, and the rest of the 38 pages are appendices. I don't know if I'm saying that right. And this was after Alexander Graham Bell got sign language banned in the Milan Conference of 1880. I am now going to be reading and discussing parts of Alexander Graham Bell's memoir upon the formation of a deaf variety of the human race, and I'll be discussing some of his exact wording as well as summarizing some stuff and giving a little bit of my opinion. Word for word, the first 2 sentences of Alexander Graham Bell's introductory remarks state, "This influence of selection and modifying our breeds of domestic animals is one of the most marked, and it is reasonable to suppose that if we could apply selection to the human race, we could also produce modifications or varieties of men. But how can we ascertain the susceptibility of the human race to variation produced by selection? We cannot dictate to men and women whom they shall marry, and natural selection no longer influences mankind to any great extent." Those were AGB's words exactly. Then after that, he says what I believe is a misogynistic idea about how strong, vigorous, and robust men naturally feel a tenderness for weak, delicate, and fragile women, and are generally repelled by physical strength and masculine traits in one of the opposite sex. Okay, those were AGB words too, not mine. So I believe that all that touches on a lot of gender issues. You could say transphobia, misogyny, like all of it, queerphobia, yeah, homophobia. There's just like a lot of stuff happening there. And then he says some ableist stuff about diseases being hereditary. And if the people with the diseases were to intermarry a number of successive generations, it is doubtful if any permanent variety of the race could be formed because of premature death, and thus that they would basically lead to extinction of themselves. But that to me is silly thinking, because otherwise, diseases wouldn't exist already. But okay. And then from there, he goes, on the other hand, it is reasonable to suppose that the continuous intermarriage of persons possessing congenital defects not associated with diminished vitality or vigor of constitution would result after a number of generations in production of a vigorous but defective variety of the race. And after that, he starts discussing albinos marrying. And so, all of this touches on a long history of racism that I can't even really begin to speak on, but, I think, but yeah, that was, definitely some shit. And then he says, we cannot control the marriage of men as we can the breeding of animals, and at first sight there seems to be no way of ascertaining how far human beings are susceptible of variation by selection. And then his exact words after that, which were also his exact words, are, such a conclusion, however, would be incorrect, and I desire to direct attention to the fact that in this country, deaf mutes marry deaf mutes. He goes on to say, there has been some selective influence at work which has caused and is still causing the continuous selection of the deaf by the deaf in marriage. If the laws of heredity that are known to hold in the case of animals also apply to men, the intermarriage of congenital deaf mute through a number of successive generations should result in the formation of a deaf variety of the human race. He also says, there are good grounds for the belief that a thorough investigation of the marriages of the deaf and the influence of these marriages upon the offspring will afford a solution of the problem. To what extent is the human race susceptible of variation by selection? Now I'm going to tell you what each of the 6 chapters are called. Chapter 1 is about upon the materials for the formation of a deaf variety of the human race at present existing in America. This chapter is about a list of family names in which deafness is genetic. And it goes into detail what deaf relationships there were in deaf schools. Chapter 2 is called Marriages of the Deaf. And this is all about the amount of deaf people marrying in different places in the United States. Chapter 3 is called Deaf-Mute Offspring of Deaf-Mute Marriages, which is about how many of those people gave birth to deaf kids. Chapter 4 is called Families of Deaf Mutes. And this is about trying to connect the family lines of deaf people. Chapter 5 is called Upon the Growth of the Deaf Mute Population. It's literally a bitch fest that deaf people exist. Chapter 6 is called Upon the Causes that Determine the Selection of the Deaf by the Deaf in Marriage. He says, sexual selection is at work among the deaf and dumb, tending to produce the deaf variety of the human race. Then he goes on to list ways to control deaf sexuality in marriage. These ideas lay the groundwork for forced sterilization of deaf and disabled people, as well as us having to fight for marriage equality. The conclusion of all of this begins by saying, I think all will agree that the evidence shows a tendency to the formation of a deaf variety of the human race in America. What remedial measures can be taken to lessen or check this tendency, we shall consider the subject under 2 heads: repressive, preventative measures. And this is why, to me, telling me you wrote a world of silence with non-deaf people sounds like AGB's fantasy book.